I never thought I'd be telling this story, but here we are. Living in Oak Ridge Estates seemed like a dream come true when my wife Sarah and I moved in 3 years ago. Beautiful homes, manicured lawns, and a community pool just 2 blocks away. Perfect for our son, Max, who has cystic fibrosis and benefits greatly from swimming therapy. What we didn't account for was Karen Willoughby, the Home Owners Association president who ruled our neighborhood like her personal fiefdom. Karen was the epitome of suburban entitlement. Mid-50s, immaculate blonde bob that never moved an inch, designer sunglasses perpetually perched on her head, and a voice that could cut through steel when she found something that violated her precious HOA guidelines. And boy, did she love those guidelines. I swear she slept with the rulebook under her pillow. The bylaws are what keep our property values high, she'd remind everyone at the monthly meetings, speaking slowly as though addressing kindergartners. Without proper enforcement, this neighborhood would descend into chaos. The first run-in I had with Karen was relatively minor. I'd installed a small ramp at our front entrance to make it easier for Max to navigate with his equipment when he was having difficult days. The contractor assured me it was within code, but that didn't stop Karen from marching up our driveway one Saturday morning, clipboard in hand. "Excuse me," she said with a sugary sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. "I don't recall the Architectural Review Committee approving this modification." She gestured dismissively at the ramp as though it was a pile of garbage. I explained that it was for my son's medical needs and showed her the relevant section of the Americans with Disabilities Act that protected our right to make reasonable modifications. She smiled tightly and left, but I could tell this wasn't over. Over the next few months, we received violation notices for the most absurd things. Our trash cans were visible from the street for 30 minutes too long. The shade of white we used to touch up our fence trim was apparently eggshell, when the approved color was pearl. My favorite was when she cited us for excessive medical equipment visible through windows, referring to Max's nebulizer that we kept in the living room. I contested each violation methodically, citing relevant laws and regulations. I'm not a lawyer, but I am an engineer, and if there's one thing I excel at, it's researching and understanding complex systems of rules. Karen didn't like being challenged, especially by someone who knew the rulebook as well as she did. Things escalated when we installed a small generator as backup power for Max's medical equipment. Living in an area prone to occasional power outages, we couldn't risk his treatments being interrupted. We followed all city codes, kept it behind a decorative lattice screen, and it was barely audible when running. But Karen, with her supernatural ability to detect any change in the neighborhood, showed up less than 24 hours after installation. "Generators are expressly prohibited under Section 7.3 of our covenants," she declared, arms crossed over her chest. "It's an eyesore and the noise pollution affects everyone's quality of life." I invited her to listen to it running, which she reluctantly did, then pointed out that it was actually quieter than her husband's beloved vintage Mustang that he revved every Sunday morning. I also explained that this was, again, protected as a reasonable accommodation for a medical necessity. Her face tightened. "We'll see about that," she said with a cold smile that made my stomach clench. "The board meets next week." The board, unsurprisingly, was made up of Karen's personal friends and people too intimidated to stand against her. But I came prepared, with printouts of relevant laws, doctor's notes, and testimonials from neighbors who supported us. I even brought Max's pulmonologist who explained via video call the critical nature of the equipment we needed to keep powered. Faced with potential legal liability, the board voted to grant us an exception. Karen fumed silently, her knuckles white around her gavel. As we left the meeting, she brushed past me and whispered, "This isn't over." I brushed it off as empty threats from someone unaccustomed to losing. That was my mistake. The following month, we took Max on a weekend trip to visit his grandparents. We were gone from Friday afternoon until Sunday evening. When we arrived home, I noticed immediately that the generator was missing. At first, I thought it might have been stolen by random thieves, but our security camera footage showed something far more disturbing. There was Karen, at 7:15 Saturday morning, directing 2 men in unmarked coveralls as they disconnected and removed our generator. She pointed and gestured imperiously, checking her watch repeatedly as though she had scheduled this operation with military precision. The men loaded it onto a truck and drove away while Karen stood watching, a satisfied smile on her face. I was livid. This wasn't just petty harassment anymore, This was theft of medical equipment. Equipment that cost over $2,000 and, more importantly, ensured my son's treatments wouldn't be interrupted during power outages. I called the police immediately. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes. I showed them the security footage and explained the situation. One of them recognized Karen immediately. "Mrs. Willoughby?" "The HOA president?" he asked, eyebrows raised. "We've had calls about her before." They took my statement and the video evidence, explaining that since the generator's value exceeded $1,000, this constituted grand larceny, a felony in our state. They assured me they would handle it and suggested I contact our insurance company in the meantime. Less than an hour later, I watched through our front window as a police cruiser pulled up to Karen's immaculate colonial-style house 3 doors down. The officers spoke with her on the porch for several minutes. Even from a distance, I could see her body language shift from confident indignation to growing concern. She kept gesturing emphatically, probably spinning some story about how she was simply enforcing HOA rules. The next morning, Monday, I was working from home when I heard a commotion outside. I looked out to see Karen being escorted to a police car, hands cuffed behind her back. She wasn't being roughly handled, but the officers were clearly not buying whatever she was selling. Neighbors emerged from their homes, staring in disbelief as the HOA Queen Bee was placed in the back of a police cruiser. My phone started buzzing with text messages from neighbors who had witnessed the scene. Apparently, when questioned further, Karen had refused to disclose the location of our generator, insisting she had the right to remove it as HOA president. This had escalated from a civil matter to criminal obstruction. I later learned from Detective Rivera, who followed up with me that afternoon, that Karen had paid a landscaping company to remove the generator, telling them she was authorized by the homeowner to have it taken away. She had then arranged for it to be stored at her brother-in-law's warehouse in the next county over. "We've recovered your property," Detective Rivera informed me with a small smile. "It appears to be undamaged. And Mrs. Willoughby has been charged with grand larceny, filing a false report, and obstruction of justice. Given that this involved medical equipment for a child, the district attorney is taking it quite seriously." Karen was released on bail that evening. I saw her return home, escorted by her husband who looked like he'd aged 10 years in a day. She glanced at our house with a mixture of hatred and fear, quickly looking away when she noticed me watching from the window. The following week, an emergency HOA meeting was called. Karen's vice president, a nervous man named Doug who had always been her faithful yes-man, presided instead. The atmosphere was tense as he announced that Karen had been temporarily removed from her position pending the resolution of her legal issues. When the floor opened for comments, several neighbors who had previously been too intimidated to speak up recounted their own horror stories of Karen's reign of terror. It was like a dam had broken. Years of accumulated grievances poured out as people described arbitrary fines, personal vendettas, and selective enforcement of rules. By the meeting's end, a motion had been proposed and overwhelmingly passed to permanently remove Karen from the board. As the votes were tallied, Karen, who had been sitting silently in the back row, stood up abruptly. "You can't do this," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "I've given 8 years to this community. I've kept your property values high. I've protected the integrity of this neighborhood." Her voice cracked as she looked around the room, finding no sympathy in the faces staring back at her. "This is all your fault," she suddenly screeched, pointing directly at me. "You and your special needs and special exceptions and special equipment." Her husband tried to guide her toward the exit, but she shook him off. The room fell silent as she stood there, mascara beginning to streak down her face. "Do you have any idea what this is going to do to my real estate business?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "Who's going to list their home with someone facing felony charges?" It was the first time I'd seen genuine fear in her eyes. Not fear of losing control or power, but fear of real-world consequences. The legal fees alone would be substantial, but the damage to her professional reputation in our small community might be irreparable. Without another word, she turned and stormed out, the door slamming behind her with a finality that seemed to punctuate the end of her reign. Doug cleared his throat awkwardly and moved on to the next agenda item, but I barely heard him. I was still processing the fact that after months of harassment and intimidation, justice had finally caught up with Karen Willoughby, and all it took was her own hubris leading her to commit a felony on camera.